When the ritual ended, the air didn't feel cleansed. It felt suspended, as if something had paused, watching, deciding. In Volume 2, we watched the veil lift. The spirit of the girl, once a whisper, became a presence. The doll, silent for over a century, moved. And through it all, we uncovered the diary of a forgotten child who only wanted someone to play with. But closure doesn't come just because we want it. It comes only when the past feels heard. Now, in our final descent into Yuma's most haunted ground, we look at what was left behind, the way the prison's atmosphere shifted, the reports that started slowing, but never quite stopped. Because when you stir up something that's waited this long, it doesn't just go back to sleep. We reflect on what we've seen. We listen to what the silence says. And we ask, did we help a restless child finally rest? Or did we just draw back the curtain on something that runs deeper than one life, one legend, or one prison? This is the final chapter, and what waits at the end might not be what we expected. Welcome to Volume 3 of Arizona, The Doll in the Red Dress. We've reached the echo chamber of the forgotten, and it's time to listen. If you thought this tale was chilling, wait until you hear what's lurking in the next state. Hit subscribe to MindFuel and fuel your nightmares with every spine-tingling upload. There was a rule in the paranormal field, one they rarely spoke aloud, but all understood. Don't mistake silence for peace. He'd performed the ritual as faithfully as he could, followed every instruction, recited the words exactly, honored her belongings. And yet, even as the air lightened, as the feeling of tension left the room like steam from a cooling kettle, something inside him refused to relax. It was too quiet now. He lingered in the hidden chamber, kneeling near the chalk outline and the doll, trying to convince himself it was over. That the smile he'd seen from the girl meant freedom, that the prison could finally breathe again. But the longer he waited, the more that smile began to change in his memory. Not warmth, not peace, relief, as if she had been waiting for something too. He shifted. The concrete floor bit into his knees. The air had grown cold again, but it was still. Too still. And then the sound came. At first it was just a light scraping, like something dragging against the stone behind him. He turned quickly. Nothing. Then it came again, this time from the other side, scraping, dragging, shuffling, like tiny hands pulling fabric across the floor. He reached for his flashlight, but the bulb flickered and sputtered the moment it turned on. He tapped it, once, twice, then stopped. The doll. It had moved. It now sat upright, no longer where he had placed it. Its head tilted toward the darkened corner of the room. He hadn't touched it. No one had. His breath caught. His fingers went numb. The silence broke again, but this time, it wasn't a noise. It was a voice. Small, trembling. Where were you? He didn't recognize it, at first. Not until the air shifted again and he saw her. Eliza, but not like before. Not the fleeting vision in the red dress. She was clearer now, defined, solid. She stood near the far wall, her little hand curled at her side, hair wet and clinging to her forehead, her dress stained with something darker than water. Tears ran clean tracks through the dirt on her face. You said you would come back. The words weren't meant for him. They were for someone else. Someone who had left her behind. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The doll's head turned, without warning, jerking slightly to face her. The movement made a small, audible creak, as if its joints weren't made of fabric, but of bone. Eliza looked at it, and her entire posture changed. She stepped back, one foot, then another, and she started to cry. Not like a little girl, like a soul that had been crying for years. He stood, unsure of what he was witnessing, unsure if this was a memory or something far more real. Then, the temperature dropped, like ice poured down his spine. The flashlight, long dead, flickered back to life on its own, casting its weak beam directly at the wall where the chalk drawing had once been. But now, the chalk had returned. Fresh. A new drawing. A tall, thin figure looming behind a small girl, arms outstretched, not to comfort but to grasp. He looked back at Eliza. Her eyes were wide, staring at something he couldn't yet see. And then, the doll stood up, not fell over, stood, its head tilted, arms limp, dress fluttering slightly though no wind moved. Eliza shrieked and backed away into the shadows, fading from view as if pulled by unseen hands. The doll turned to face him. No eyes, no expression, just that crude stitching, that red dress. He froze. A presence pressed inward, thick, suffocating. He realized the ritual hadn't ended. It had only opened something. The diary's final page, the one he'd dismissed as childish, came screaming back into his mind. "I didn't want to go alone!" Eliza hadn't summoned the doll. The doll had summoned her. Its origin wasn't a comfort object. It was a vessel, a lure. And now, it had chosen him. He backed up slowly, flashlight trembling in his hand, beam wobbling across the stones. He needed to speak, to finish what had been started, but his voice cracked in his throat. The doll took a step forward, its foot dragged, scraping just like before. Another step, another. It was slow, but precise, as though it had been waiting centuries for this moment and didn't need to rush. Then he remembered something from the priest's notes, half legible in the margins. "If it moves, do not run. It does not chase, it remembers." He steadied himself. His mouth was dry. His heart pounded against his ribs like it wanted out. He forced himself to speak, not a scream, not a plea, just the final line. "You are seen. You are held. You may rest." He repeated it, louder. "You are seen. You are held. You may rest." The doll stopped. The room trembled, not from noise, not from movement, from memory. A pressure collapsed in on itself like a lung exhaling after being full too long. The chalk drawing vanished. The cold began to lift. And then, without fanfare, the doll crumpled to the ground. Limpio. Still. He waited. Minutes passed. Then, from somewhere deep in the walls, far beyond the reach of the prison's boundaries, he heard a child's voice. Software content. If you thought this tale was chilling, wait until you hear what's lurking in the next state. Hit subscribe to MindFuel and fuel your nightmares with every spine-tingling upload. By morning, the prison didn't feel the same, and that was the first sign something had, in fact, shifted. The air was still thick, still old, still heavy with stories whispered through iron bars and sandstone walls, but it no longer pressed in the way it used to. It no longer felt like a presence was watching every step, measuring every breath. The rooms weren't warmer, far from it, but the biting edge had dulled, like something, or someone, had finally let go. He left the hidden chamber in silence, flashlight in hand, boots crunching over gravel and dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. The path back through the cell blocks felt longer than before, not because it physically was, but because something behind him had stayed. There was no dramatic exit, no gust of wind, no crashing door, just absence. It was as though the walls themselves had finally exhaled. And yet, that sense of resolution came laced with a strange, uneasy quiet. Because the thing about absence is, it can feel just as alive as presence, especially in places like this, especially when you've seen what lies between the cracks. He returned to the surface at dawn. The sun cast long shadows across the dry desert stones, illuminating the rusted gates and the weathered guard towers in a light that felt softer than it should have. Outside, the early tour groups were gathering, mostly tourists, some ghost hunters, a couple of history buffs. Their chatter was light, unaware, the way you talk before entering a place that doesn't really belong to the living. But that day, something was different. The usual hush that fell over visitors as they stepped through the prison gates was still there. But the tension? That feeling like fingers on the back of your neck, like eyes peering from the darkness? It didn't meet them. The front desk staff noticed it first. No electronic glitches, no whispered complaints of being touched, no pinches from unseen hands targeting the ones in red. Not even the temperature sensors, usually erratic in the East Wing, gave off the usual spike. For the first time in a long while, the prison behaved like a building, not a mouth. And that should have brought comfort. But for him, the investigator, it only deepened the mystery. Because places like the Yuma Territorial Prison didn't just stop being haunted. They didn't just give up their stories. They shifted. They adapted. They remembered. He stayed another night, not to provoke, not to record, but to listen. He wandered the yards at dusk, watching the sky turn molten over the Colorado River, letting the silence settle around him. No whispers, no flickering lights. Even the notorious dark cell, the one place where pressure had always seemed to collapse in on itself, felt hollow. But in that emptiness, he sensed something else. Stillness. Not the kind that ends a story, the kind that waits. Weeks passed. Reports from the prison staff confirmed the changes were holding. Tour guides no longer lost their breath near the old punishment cells. EMF readers stopped screaming when held near the walls. The footsteps that once echoed up and down cell block 2 in the early hours of the morning, gone. One by one, the hallmarks of the haunting faded. Visitors in red scarves or jackets, left unbothered. No pinches, no drafts, no cold spots lingering like a breath on skin. But every so often, just once in a while, someone would say something odd. They'd pass through the cell blocks and pause just for a moment and say, "It's sadder than I thought it would be," and move on. The staff chalked it up to atmosphere. Old stone, dead history. But the investigator knew better. Sadness had always been there. It was just finally visible. Without the anger, without the fear, without the need to be heard through scratches and shadows. Then came the final confirmation. One afternoon, a group of students from a nearby college arrived for a historical tour. Among them, a girl, quiet, curious, paused in the old warden's office where some of the recovered artifacts were now on display. She stared at the glass case where the doll had been placed, sealed behind thick plexiglass, stitched eyes frozen mid-gaze. She didn't touch it. She only leaned in and whispered, "She's not with it anymore." The tour guide asked what she meant, but the girl just shrugged. "She's gone. I think she left something behind. But it's not her." And that was when it struck him. The ritual had worked, but not in the way the books had described. He hadn't banished a ghost. He hadn't closed a loop. He'd given a name back to the forgotten. He had acknowledged her. Eliza, a girl who drowned one summer chasing a doll that might never have been just a toy. A girl buried not in a grave, but in silence. The prison is quieter now. Still old. Still cracked. Still bearing the weight of those who lived and died behind its rusted bars. But its heaviest shadow is gone. And if you stand at the edge of the exercise yard, just as the sun begins to fall behind the river, you might hear the laughter of modern-day children echoing from the park nearby. It doesn't clash with the prison stillness. It completes it. For the first time in over a century, someone's little girl is no longer waiting to be found. And the doll? It remains in its case, still. But every few months, a visitor will swear they saw it shift, just slightly, as if adjusting to the light. As if remembering what it once held, or waiting for the next story to begin. If you thought this tale was chilling, wait until you hear what's lurking in the next state. Hit subscribe to MindFuel and fuel your nightmares with every spine-tingling upload. In the weeks that followed his departure from Yuma, the investigator found himself slowing down in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't exhaustion, though he had carried a deep, bone-tired fatigue from the prison, something that sleep never quite cleared. It was something quieter. Something more lasting. It was the echo. Not of sounds, not of sights, but of understanding. That what he had experienced within those sandstone walls wasn't simply a haunting. It wasn't a case file to be stamped and cataloged or a spooky tale to recount for clicks and views. It had been something older, something truer. It had been a message. And like most messages whispered from the past, it hadn't come easy. It had clawed its way through static, through flickering lights and scratches on old brick, through pinches in the dark and dreams that didn't belong to him. It had come in pieces, scattered like the remains of a girl no one bothered to mourn properly. And when he finally heard it, really heard it, everything changed. He sat in his studio, weeks later, surrounded by files, recordings, EMF readers, and tapes filled with hours of shadowy footage. But his eyes weren't on the data. They were on the photograph taped to the edge of his monitor, a blurry snapshot taken in the early hours of his second night at Yuma. The hallway outside the dark cell. In the distance, the faint curve of a red hem trailing along the stone floor. He stared at it for a long time, not searching for proof, but meaning. There had been a time earlier in his career when every haunting felt like a puzzle waiting to be solved, a presence to be confronted, a noise to be debunked, a thrill to be captured on film. But Yuma had dismantled that idea completely. What he found there wasn't a spirit to be banished. It was a story that no one ever let finish, a child's longing, a doll handmade, not possessed. A moment of abandonment that rippled across time like a stone cast into still water. He thought back to the diary, the frail handwriting, the way the final entry read like a whisper from a throat too tired to scream anymore. I just wanted someone to play with. Such a simple sentence, too simple. But behind it lived a world of pain, of forgotten birthdays, of muffled cries, of a little girl waiting beside the water's edge, clutching something that made her feel safe, until it slipped away from her fingers and floated out into the current. What if, he thought, she hadn't chased the doll into the river? What if she had followed it, hoping it would lead her to something better? Someone who'd see her, someone who'd stay. He thought, too, about the ritual. It wasn't just a ceremony. It was an apology. Not for his trespassing, but for everyone else who had walked past her story as if it didn't matter. The ghost had never wanted revenge. She wanted remembrance. And in giving her a name, Eliza, he had given her more than closure. He had given her identity. That mattered. More than the recordings. More than the sightings. More than the documentary he would eventually cut together. Because in that moment, when the candlelight flickered and the doll moved on its own, he hadn't felt fear. He had felt release. Not just hers. His too. There's a line, he realized, between the living and the dead. We like to pretend it's thick, that it's firm, that it only breaks in rare, strange places where the veil is thin. But it's not. That line is threadbare, and more often than not, We're the ones who blur it, with our grief, our forgetfulness, our neglect, with the way we carry unfinished stories in our bones and never stop to listen to the ones buried in the ground. He wondered how many other spirits weren't trapped, but unheard. How many echoes were just waiting for someone to stop chasing the phenomenon and start hearing the pain beneath it. He placed the final piece of evidence into his archive box, a small, handwritten tag from the prison's archive that had been tied to the doll. It simply read, "Unclaimed." He sat with that word for a long time. Then, slowly, he crossed it out and wrote something new beneath it. Eliza, 1886. Remembered. He hasn't returned to Yuma, not because he's afraid, but because he understands now that the work isn't always about going back. Sometimes it's about carrying forward, and that's what he does. Every case he takes now, he begins not with gear, but with a question. Whose voice have we forgotten? Because that's where truth begins, not with screams in the dark or objects flung across the room, but with quiet stories written in the margins, stories like Eliza's. By the time the last voice had faded from the halls of Yuma, the investigator knew the work wasn't done. He had peeled back one layer of silence, but there were more, many more. Stories tucked in between forgotten border towns and arid hills, in abandoned mining outposts along quiet stretches of highway where headlights blink and radios stutter with voices that shouldn't be there. In places where the desert doesn't just stretch, it watches. So he turned his eyes east, toward New Mexico. It began with a single letter, old, yellowed at the edges, tucked into a collection of 1930s trail guides found in a second-hand bookshop just outside Santa Fe. The envelope had no return address, just a smudged red wax seal in the shape of a handprint. Fingers spread wide, as though trying to hold something back, or warn someone to stay away. Inside was a note, written in a child's looping script, but stained with something too dark to be just an age. The drums only stop when the wind dies. Don't listen when she calls. Don't answer, no matter what voice she uses, and never, ever bring her a gift. It wasn't signed, but penciled in the corner, faint, as though the writer had changed their mind at the last second, was a single name, Chimayo. Chimayo. A place whispered about in hushed tones among locals, known for its healing earth, for the santuario and the faithful who believe the soil holds miracles. But beyond the walls of that sacred place, stories linger, stories the tourists never hear, of a woman who walks the arroyos long after sunset, of cattle found hollowed with no tracks in the sand, of children who go missing during the winds and come back speaking a different language, of drums that beat when no one's playing them, and of a cave, sealed off long ago, that no one dares to name. The investigator has already begun gathering the fragments, field recordings from the mesa, folklore passed from grandfather to grandson, ranger logs filed late at night, redacted heavily in black ink, and a weathered cassette tape left anonymously in the glove compartment of his rental car, containing a single phrase whispered over and over in Spanish, "Ella no es de aquí." She is not from here. Next time, we follow that trail, from the outskirts of Chimayo to the ridgeline of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, where the wind speaks in riddles and old rituals are still practiced in secret, where something waits in the shadows of the cottonwoods, and not all prayers are answered with kindness. Episode Arkansas. The Gurdon Light, Phantom of the Tracks. Stay with us. Some stories don't want to stay buried, and the deeper we go, the louder they become. If you thought this tale was chilling, wait until you hear what's lurking in the next state. Hit subscribe to MindFuel and fuel your nightmares with every spine-tingling upload. The air inside Yuma Territorial Prison is still. Not just quiet, but still. The kind of silence that seems to watch you back. The cameras have long stopped rolling, the recorders packed away, and yet, something lingers. It always does. Maybe it's in the subtle creak of old floorboards that no longer bear footsteps, or the way the red dress continues to show up, once in a reflection, once in a streak of static, once in a child's crayon drawing left behind on a museum bench with no child in sight. Some stories fade. This one learned how to stay. And while the prison's unrest may have calmed, for now, the road ahead winds deeper into America's forgotten places, toward other legends, other names scratched into stone and buried in silence, toward truths not kept in books, but in whispers passed through generations. Because this journey doesn't end in Yuma. It only starts here. So if you felt the chill of something watching from the shadows, if your breath caught at the echo of a voice that wasn't yours, if you glanced over your shoulder just once during this story, then you're exactly where you belong. Because next, we head east, into the heart of Arkansas, a place where forests swallow entire towns, where the fog rolls in without warning, and where something old still moves beneath the Ozarks, draped in teeth and silence. What lives there doesn't knock. It waits. And you've already opened the door. If this tale left its mark, if your skin still crawls with questions, if you think this was chilling, wait until you hear what's lurking in Arkansas. Subscribe to MindFuel. Fuel your nightmares. And prepare for what comes next. Because what's out there, it remembers those who listen. And now, it knows you're listening. If you think this tale was chilling, wait until you hear what's lurking in the next state. Subscribe to MindFuel and fuel your nightmares with every new upload.